Won't You Help Me Pull My Wagon by KholdstareV. Twilight looked around, frowning. Going to that nightmare night party had been a bad decision through and through. In spite of the high energy of the place, she found herself simply incapable of having any fun. The atmosphere was dark, the strobe lights were garish, the thumping music was loud and overbearing. The ponies present were far different than the crowd she was used to, doing questionable substances and engaging in questionable activities. There was no one there she knew. She felt nervous and claustrophobic, having taken refuge in a corner and just standing there for a desperately long time, just watching. She was waiting for something to come to her, but for what? She wasn't quite sure. Perhaps either for a reason to justify her being there, or for the will to just leave. In her solitude, she reflected on how she had ended up there. All of her friends had planned to go to a nightmare night party in another town, and had invited her along. However, due to circumstances that were entirely her own fault, she missed the opportunity to go, finding herself alone on nightmare night with no costume and no plans. She had hastily contacted an acquaintance who she had heard was throwing her own party. The acquaintance had said it was cool if she came, and gave her directions to the secluded barn in the woods where the party was being held. And there Twilight was, alone, afraid, and unable at that moment to even recall what the acquaintance's name was. Twilight glanced at the wall clock above her head. It was almost 11 o'clock. She had sighed to herself, wondering how much more time she planned to waste here. At that moment, a high-pitched scream sounded from the crowd nearby. She turned to its source, and saw a group of 3 friends shambling nearby, consisting of a male unicorn, a male Pegasus, and a female earth pony. The mare, who was the one who had screamed, shoved the male unicorn playfully. "Don't scare me like that," she yelled above the noise. "It's mean." "Well, it's true," he protested. "Why do you think they decided to have a party in this barn, in this part of the woods? 'Cause this area is supposedly haunted." "No, it's not. Stop that," she cried back. "I heard that too," the male Pegasus pitched in. The 3 of them flopped down on a bale of hay right near where Twilight was, not appearing to even notice her, but she still felt uncomfortable. She squeezed herself even deeper into her corner, wanting to stay as far away from any strangers as she could. The male Pegasus continued. "There's a story about some old hag or something, right? Some old, Madam something or other." "Old Madam Flynn," the male unicorn confirmed. "Yeah, that's a classic one from these parts." "Yeah, that's it. But doesn't she also go by some nickname? Old Madam, Skin? Old Madam Skin?" questioned the girl. "Ew, weird. Why do they call her that?" "I've heard it's 'cause her skin's so loose and wrinkled," the male unicorn said, deepening his voice to a spooky effect. "That it hangs off her bones like a fleshy gray sack, they say. She wanders these woods at night, searching for her lost bottle of skin cream. If you see her, the grotesqueness of the sight will cause you to drop dead." "Oh my gosh, that's so freaky," blurted the girl. "And that's not even the creepiest part," the male unicorn continued. "According to the dude that told me the story, no one really can agree on what type of creature she is. Some versions, he told me, describes her as a mule, but other versions say that she's a mare, or a griffin, or a zebra, while others say that she's none of those, that she's something else entirely unidentified, unnatural to this world, monster, demon. No one knows for sure though, because as I said, anyone who sees her," dramatic pause, "drops dead." He leaped at his 2 friends as he said the last word, startling the male Pegasus and causing the mare to scream again. By this point, Twilight could stand no more. Deciding that the will to leave had reached her before the justification for staying, she abandoned her corner and began to push her way through the wild crowd towards the exit. As she did, she heard the last bits of conversation from the group of three before it was drowned out by the sounds of the party. That's about it. Of course, there's plenty more where that came from. I have heard a ton of good ghost stories from the locals here. Oh no, I'm scared. I want to go home now. You're tripping. Bro, if anyone who sees this old chick dies, then where'd the stories come from, huh? Hell if I know. Man, all I know is that some ponies have died some pretty weird deaths in these woods, and apparently at least a couple of them can be blamed on old Madam Skin. Twilight shuffled along the dirt path leading away from the barn. She trotted slowly, with her head hung down, lamenting that her nightmare night had gone so disappointingly wrong. Guess I'll just go home and sulk, she told herself, and wait for tomorrow when my friends tell me all about the fun they've had without me. When she reached the edge of the woods that she knew she had to go through to get back to Ponyville, she looked up and peered at the dirt road leading into it. She stopped and stared. She had arrived on this very same trail earlier that night, and yet, looking at it now, she couldn't help but feel that it appeared much darker than before. Why was that? Why did the blackness of the forest and the army of gnarled trees now seem to be an unforgiving maw, devouring the path whole? Why did she feel this creeping fear? Figuring it was a result of her bad mood at the moment, she continued forward into the dark maw of the forest, with no other desire on her mind but then to get back home. Twilight walked for several minutes, trying to focus on staying on the trail ahead of her. It bended well enough with the natural ground of the forest that, in the darkness of the night, it would have been very easy to veer off and get lost. Along the way, she realized that a couple of things were very odd. For one thing, her illumination spell, which had been a big help on her way to the party, was now virtually useless, for the abnormal darkness seemed to swallow up any light whole. Secondly, on her initial trip through, the woods had sounded of nocturnal creature activity. This time, however, there was a deathly silence. There was no hooting of any owls, nor the skittering of any raccoons. Even the breeze held its breath. The only sounds were her own hoofsteps and her own shuddering breaths. Suddenly, a foreign sound reached Twilight's ears. It was a soft groan, almost like a distant animal in pain. She froze. She then heard it again, and turned her ears to localize the source. It seemed to be coming from a short ways up the trail, which she could see was wrapped around a large tree forming a bend. Curious but cautious, she crept towards the bend. As the sound grew closer, it evolved. Instead of a single stunted groan, it now sounded as a long, continuous, sickly moan, as though some creature was letting out a long breath through a tired throat. When at last Twilight reached the tree, she hesitantly peeked around the bend, and in that instant, the noise hushed, and she found herself staring at a curious sight. A few yards ahead, standing crooked off the side of the trail, was a covered wagon. It looked old, but in still some reasonable shape. The fabric of the cover was faded and dusty, but still intact without any rips. The wooden wheels were chipped and moldy, but still serviceable. The painted picture on the side showing a brown pear being peeled by a curved knife. It was washed out, but visible. What was most curious to Twilight was the fact that it was even there at all. She knew for certain that it hadn't been there the first time she had passed through. The position of the wagon made it look as though it had been hastily abandoned, carelessly left to run off the path. She could only figure that someone had recently left, or that she had ended up on a completely different path than the one she had came from, and was now lost. Both possibilities troubled her. Trying not to think too much about it, Twilight continued walking slowly. As she neared the wagon, she veered to the left, hugging the trees, distancing herself as much as she could. She tried to force herself to look forward down the path, but the wagon remained stuck in the corner of her vision. She quickened her pace. Then, after a tense few seconds, she finally passed it. Feeling relieved, she went on walking at a normal speed, refusing to look back.
Young miss?
Twilight nearly jumped out of her skin at the sound of the voice that came so suddenly. She stopped dead in her tracks and listened.
Young miss, help me, please.
The elderly female voice was coarse and scratchy. It was difficult to tell exactly where it was coming from, for it seemed to echo off the trees and even in the air itself. However, Twilight found herself turning her back to the mysterious wagon. A black curtain was draped over the opening, concealing what was inside. With a gulp, she responded.
Yes? Who's there?
Oh, you can call me Miss Pear,
The voice said softly.
I'm within the wagon you see before you. My chauffeur has deserted me. I need to get home. It's dark and frightening in these woods. Please, help me.
Despite the unsettling qualities of the voice, the emotion in it was sad and desperate. Twilight found her nervousness being replaced by a soft sympathy. She took a step forward toward the wagon.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Of course I'll help you, however I can. What do you need me to do?
Young miss, wouldn't you please help me pull my wagon? It's full of my wares, and I'm too old and feeble to pull it myself. Additionally, I'm afraid of what's out there in the dark forest. The pear orchard where I live is not far from here, and there should be a dog tag hanging from the wagon's harness with my address on it. Please, I beg for your assistance.
Twilight angled her lip.
I don't know, ma'am. I'm afraid to go too far out that way. I need to get home myself. I'm not even exactly sure where I am right now.
I will guide you on how to get to my orchard, and once we arrive, I promise to either help you find your own way home, or give you a place to rest for the night. I'll even reward you. Please, I'm cold and worried. You wouldn't leave a defenseless old crow in the woods like this, would you?
Twilight was still uncertain, but decided that there was only one right answer to that question. What kind of pony would she be if she said no? Besides, she thought, maybe by doing this one good deed, her nightmare night may end up being worthwhile for something. With a nod of her head, Twilight began to approach the wagon.
Don't worry, ma'am. I'll pull your wagon for you, and you don't need to give me a reward, though. I'm happy to help.
A soft, ambient chuckle sounded from within the cover.
Bless you, young miss. You're my guardian angel tonight.
Twilight smiled to herself as she reached the harness. She used her magic to levitate the attached dog tag up to her face, and she read the unfamiliar address etched into it before hanging it back to where it was. She was then ready to pick up the harness itself and fasten it on, but stopped when she spotted something in the dirt road that she hadn't noticed in the darkness earlier. A trail of hoofprints, which ran from underneath the wagon and up the road ahead. She figured they belonged to the wagon's original chauffeur, which made enough sense, but closer inspection revealed some peculiar details. The hoofprints were rather far apart from each other, as though he had been running. Additionally, at a point about 20 feet ahead, the tracks veered off to the right and vanished into the brush along the side of the trail. What was most suspicious of all, however, were the drops of what appeared to be dark liquid that accompanied the tracks all the way to their vanishing point. Twilight knew what the liquid looked like, but forced the thought out of her head. It was too troubling.
I would greatly appreciate it if we could go on our way now, young miss. I know not of what injured my chauffeur and caused him to abandon me as he did, but if we are to avoid it ourselves, we must make haste.
The troubling thought suddenly came crashing back into Twilight's mind. The previous chauffeur had been injured? By what? Some nocturnal predator? While she was deathly curious, she also felt an urge to simply run away herself and not look back. But how could she, when another was in such desperate need of help? The poor thing had already been abandoned once, and Twilight did not intend to do the same to her. She felt confident, too, that she was able to stave off any threats with her own potent magic, especially if it meant protecting the life of an innocent. And so, in spite of the apparent risk, she stood firm where she was and turned to look at the black curtain. "Absolutely, ma'am. We'll be on our way soon, but may I at least see your face before we go?" Her request was followed by a moment of silence. "No," the voice said simply. "Why not?" Twilight asked. "I'd just like to see who it is I'm doing such a big favor for." "You'll see me soon enough," the voice replied. "But I'm too frightened of the outside woods and its dangers to even peek out there. I apologize." "Oh, then let me peek in there," Twilight said in a friendly tone, trotting over to the front of the wagon. "It's just I'd feel more comfortable if I could see your face. Just a quick look is all I want. Nothing will happen, I promise." She reached her hoof up to the black curtain, planning to part it just the smallest amount. "No!" Twilight withdrew her hoof and jumped back immediately. The voice's outburst was so hellishly angry that it made her choke on her own breath. She stood panting for several seconds, immediately beginning to reconsider her decision to help.
Please, forgive me, young miss. You must understand, it's only my fear of the woods that's made me lash out so strongly. I am truly grateful you've offered your aid and do not wish to upset you. I only ask that you please do not open this curtain and withhold your curiosity for now."
Twilight, still reeling from the shock, nodded nervously. "Okay, I'm sorry," was all she managed to say. She walked over to the harness, and after a brief moment of hesitation, used her magic to fasten herself. When the buckle was secured, she took a deep breath and turned her head, looking at the black curtain again.
"All right, ma'am, I'm ready. Where shall I go?"
"Thank you again. Start by turning right and then simply go straight. That's the shortest way."
Twilight looked to her right and raised an eyebrow.
"But, ma'am, that leads off the trail and into the woods."
"I know, but if we are both to get through these woods into the safety of our homes as quickly as possible, then you must listen to me. I promise. It's our safest option."
Twilight frowned, but seeing as she didn't know these woods at all, she couldn't argue.
Okay, I trust you,"
she eventually said. She took a step forward, pulling the wagon a good few inches. It was heavy, but not nearly as heavy as she was expecting. If she didn't know better, she would have guessed that she was pulling the weight of an empty wagon itself, and nothing more. She sighed in relief, expecting an easy trip. Before long, she was galloping at a steady pace, pulling the creaking wagon behind her with only moderate effort. She turned right, leading herself and the wagon off the trail and into the thicket of trees. The woods remained maddeningly quiet as Twilight marched on. The only sounds she could hear now were those of her own hoofsteps, her own shuddered breaths, and the creak, creak, creak of the wagon's rotating wheels. Every now and again, she would glance and peer at the black curtain, which was perpetually 3 feet behind her. Ever since her departure from the trail at least 15 minutes before, the voice from beyond it had remained curiously mute. Twilight took this to mean that she was heading in the right direction, but the silence was making her uncomfortable. At one point, she felt an odd sensation on the small of her back. It felt like a tickle at first, and then a sharp poke of a needle. Thinking it had to be a bug biting her, she whipped at the spot with her tail. That seemed to make the bug leave, but the sting lingered. She grimaced, trying to ignore it. So, Miss Pear, she began, trying to make conversation. These woods actually seem kind of quiet and peaceful, at least right now. Are you sure we still need to be worried? She gave the voice several seconds to reply. None came. Feeling her discomfort escalate, Twilight continued. And what exactly happened to your old chauffeur anyway? What could have caused him to leave you behind so abruptly?
That is what had me so afraid,
the voice at last explained.
I believe he encountered something truly frightening in this place. I only recall the sound of his screams disappearing into the night as he ran far away, leaving me in my wagon to lay helplessly by the side of the road. I know not what the thing was, what it did to him, or if it's still nearby.
The voice began to build in volume and intensity.
But my young miss, I would advise you to be watchful in these parts of the woods. They are calm by day, but when the black curtain of night falls, doorways within them have been known to open.
Twilight had hoped the conversation would calm her nerves. However, the voice's haunting words only made her nerves tingle even more. Her heart began to palpitate more quickly. She picked up her pace, speeding up the creak, creak, creak of the wagon's wheels. What do you mean? Asked Twilight fearfully. What kind of doorways?
Doorways to dark places unfelt by the mortal plane. Doorways that may unknowingly let in the most sinister things.
Twilight's hurried trot was now becoming a slow gallop, causing the tempo of the creak, creak, creak of the wagon's wheels to increase even more. She found herself becoming short of breath and thought to loosen the harness strap to give her lungs more room to expand. However, when she tried to undo the buckle with her magic, she found it stuck tight. Another tickle and poke sensation crept up her flank. She swept at it with her tail.
I don't understand,
she cried, panic rising in her voice.
What sinister things are you talking about? They can be hard to describe to one such as you, but when they are near, you will know it. You will feel it. My previous chauffeur did. His screams of blood-boiled terror could only have come from being taken by such a thing. It hunts still. It's here. It's near. You know it. You feel it too. Taken? But you said he ran away!
Twilight shouted. Her galloping was nearing a full sprint. The creak, creak, creak of the wagon wheels was now matched by the rapid rhythm of her thumping heart. Her eyes darted to and fro, trying to see into all the dark spaces between the trees as they zoomed past her vision. She doubled her effort to undo the buckle, but it still held tight, trapping her. Several tickles and needles invaded her back at once.
Tell me what's happening,
she yelled through oncoming tears.
What's out here?
The voice had reached the peak of its ferocity.
You cannot perceive it, you cannot understand it, but it's here, and it will take you. When it is near, you will know it, and you will feel it, but by then you will already be doomed, for you will not realize it until it's too late, when such a thing might be.
A pause that made Twilight hold her breath.
Right behind you.
At that moment, a flood of tickling, poking sensations began to swarm over Twilight's back, rushing up her flanks and the back of her neck. The sum of them all resulted in a fierce burning pain that caused a primal scream to escape from Twilight's throat. She whipped and scraped frantically at her tail, trying to drive the bugs away. Her efforts were in vain, however. She was now at a full gallop, a speed that she never would have imagined herself capable of, her legs powered by pure fear-induced adrenaline. Twigs whipped at her face as she sped aimlessly through the trees. The creak, creak, creak of the wagon's wheels ran so fast that it now sounded like a single continuous hum. The sound invaded her ears, penetrating the wall of her sane mind. The burning of a million pinches on her back was beginning to sink into her skin, causing pain to spike. She was now bawling and screaming incessantly. With a remote part of her brain that was not overtaken by panic, she continued to try to undo the buckle that kept her bound to the wagon. She soon realized to her horror that the buckle was not merely stuck, it was locked by some dark magic she had never encountered before. She knew right away that it was not of her world. Another idea came to her. She readied her teleportation spell, hoping that she could warp herself out of the harness. Aiming for a spot about 20 feet ahead, she sparked it. She successfully warped, but to her horror, the wagon had warped with her. Whatever terrible magic this was, it would keep her bound to the wagon even if she jumped dimensions. The realization tore her up inside. She could not shed the wagon from her body. No matter how hard she ran, no matter how many bumps and gnarled roots she leapt over, it would ever remain 3 feet from her hooves. The searing anguish that was spread over her back and under her skin was beginning to creep onto her upper legs. Only Celestia knew how long she'd been running or how much longer she would have to run until she just collapsed from exhaustion and pain. Knowing that she couldn't keep this up forever, she at long last found the courage to look back. In spite of the ghastly fire invading her skin, she was astonished to see no bugs, no thorns, or even any actual wounds on her body. The demonic force that was attacking her was completely invisible, but undeniably real. With wide eyes, she switched her gaze to the black curtain. It flapped and swayed in the motion of the wagon, occasionally opening a crack in which the interior appeared visible for a split second. She could not be sure if it was her frantic mind affecting her perceptions, but when those cracks appeared, she swore she could see the form of something within, something that observed her through the cracks. Something devilish that was delighting in her pain. Something that clearly aimed to continue this torturous chase until she dropped dead. Unable to look back anymore, she aimed her vision forward again, with no other thoughts on her mind than to keep running, to keep fighting the acidic sensation spreading over her even as it grew ever worse, to keep struggling, to undo this holy spell that kept her locked to the demon wagon, to keep praying. Then, all of a sudden, just as Twilight was beginning to feel herself succumb, she heard the wicked voice fill her ears once again.
You know it. And now you feel it.
The sound of the curtain whipping open came from behind Twilight. Before Twilight could turn to look, however, a new and even worse pain suddenly erupted from her upper back. It felt as though a hand of razor-sharp claws had plunged itself into her flesh behind her collarbone, and was slowly beginning to slice down along her spine. The burning of the flood of invisible bug bites was rendered as nothing in comparison. The howl that burst from her throat was as indescribable as the pain itself. Had this torture been allowed to continue for even another second, Twilight swore that she would have passed out from the shock and never woken up. However, something happened before that second was up, something that could only be called a miracle. Subconsciously using her isolated rational part of her mind, she continued to battle the hex on the harness buckle with her own pure magic. At that climactic moment, something clicked, and with her magic managed to seep through the cracks of the dark spell, undoing it from within the buckle, burst into pieces with a flash of purple light. And she suddenly felt the weight of the wagon shed loose from her abused body. The burning, the stinging, the slicing sensation, it all disappeared at the very same instant. A wave of ecstatic relief washed over her. She continued to run several more steps, finding herself breach the edge of the line of trees into a wide clearing. It appeared to be a secluded farm, with a small cabin almost directly ahead. She could hear the sound of the now unmanned wagon rolling behind her, afraid that it might run her down. She attempted to steer herself to the left. This proved to be far too disorienting for her exhausted and overwhelmed brain, for she simply stumbled over her hooves and fell into the dirt. She threw her forelegs over the back of her neck, bracing herself from when the wagon wheels crushed her miserable bone and flesh. However, such did not happen. She felt the rushing wind of the wagon zoom right past her side, missing her by mere inches. She then peered up to see the wagon careen helplessly for several yards, eventually colliding with the side of the cabin with a loud crash. The sound of splintering glass rippled through the air, the result of the wagon's impact having shattered one of the cabin's windows. The wagon rebounded, rolling backward a couple of feet, and then came to a standstill. A brief silence followed, but it was not long before the lights within the cabin flipped on, and the murmured voices of the family were heard. Everything that happened in the next few minutes, Twilight was barely able to comprehend. Her body, her mind, her spirit, they were all so drained, so stricken, so relieved to have escaped that narrow brush with death, that her senses had all began to give way to faint. Her vision became blurred and unfocused as the family of earth ponies, consisting of 2 parents and a grown son, rushed outside to see what the commotion was. While the son went to investigate the crash site of the wagon, the parents both ran to her aid. The large father asked something directly, but her mouth failed to cooperate. She had only answered with a moan. She vaguely heard her mother cry, "She's hurt!" gesturing at a large gash on her left foreleg, likely caused by the spill she just took. The father, after seemingly observing the rest of her body, agreed that she needed urgent help. They worked together to rise her limp body onto its hooves and walked her to the cabin entrance. On the way, Twilight warped and wobbled vision settled on the son, who was doing a lap around the wagon, observing curiously. He approached the black curtain, which was at about the same level as the destroyed window, and without a moment's delay, drew it open and looked inside. Twilight could not see what he saw from her vantage point, but she could see his face. It twisted in confusion and disturbance, as though asking himself, "What in the world?" He maintained this expression as he turned his gaze to Twilight. She wanted to say something. She longed to be able to ask him what his eyes beheld inside that demonic wagon. However, the circuit between her brain and her lips was completely shot. The question, which she cried pleadingly in her mind, only came out of her mouth in a loud moan. She could only stare at him as he stared back, both wondering what the other had to say for themselves. The son then turned his attention to the dog tag dangling on the wagon's harness. He picked it up and began to read the address on it, just as Twilight was pulled to the front door of the cabin. At that point, her senses began to shut down completely. One by one, the last thing she remembered was being hastily led into a small room and allowed to collapse onto a cot before blacking out. An unknown number of hours passed before Twilight's eyes fluttered half open once again. She found that she was still in the same dark room from the cabin, lying face down on the cot that she had been left upon. Upon awakening, she felt 3 very strong bodily sensations attack her all at once. One was a splitting headache, one was a throbbing pain on her left shin, and one was a large, nagging itch on her upper back. She groaned in discomfort, her muscles still too weak to move even an inch. Looking around with her eyes, she caught sight of a handwritten letter and some white containers on a nightstand to her left. Assuming the letter was meant for her, she used her magic to levitate it and bring it in front of her eyes. It was brief and written rather sloppily, as though done so in a hurry. She read its words. "Hello. If you're awake and reading this, don't be alarmed. You're safe. You're injured, and we're fetching a nearby doctor. Use any medicine you need to. Be back soon. P.S. Our son has taken your belongings home and informed your family."
Oh, how nice of them,
Twilight thought warmly to herself. She set the letter down and looked at the white containers and realized they all held medicine. She used her magic to levitate a jar labeled ointment, and figured she'd apply some to the gash on her left shin, which had hastily been bandaged up by her savior family. Lifting the bandage and forcing herself not to look at the messy wound was not easy, but the ointment provided instant cooling relief. Then, without thinking much about it, she went ahead and applied some ointment to the maddening broad itch on her back. The irritating area felt to be several inches wide, but after a few ointment treatments, the itching subsided too. She then levitated a bottle of pain pills, hoping to ease the pounding headache. With some difficulty, she managed to get some into her mouth and swallow it. Within minutes, the effect of the drug began to seep over her, and her headache numbed down to a tolerable level. For the first time in several hours, she felt she could finally relax. With a satisfied chuckle to herself, she melted into the bed and let the feeling of solace wash over her. Twilight directed her eyes left again, past the medicine containers, and she could see that there was a small radio on the nightstand as well. Deciding she could use some ambient noise, she used her magic to flip it on. She turned the dial to her favorite station, Ponyville Glad to Chat Radio. She must have been outside Ponyville, for the station was coming in only semi-clearly, the hosts' voices obscured by a layer of static. The hosts were chatting excitedly about all the crazy early-morning nightmare night parties that were still jumping.
Maybe they'll talk about the party my friends were at,
she wondered to herself. Their story cannot compare to the one she had for them when they next met. Not even close. Curious to see as to how dark it was outside, Twilight forced her eyes to look around for a window. When she finally caught sight of one, her feeling of relaxation began to fade. The window she saw to her right, only a few feet from the cot, was completely shattered. The glass particles were still lingering on the floor. She realized right away that this was the window that had been broken by the wagon's collision. Shouldn't that have meant that the wagon was right outside? She shuddered, horrified by the thought. However, she could plainly see that the wagon was not out there anymore. All she saw through the window was the scene of the dark, pre-dawn sky cast over the forest. Where could it have gone? For some reason, pondering this made her shudder too. As if in cruel response to her running thoughts, the cheery static plague voice on the radio was suddenly cut off, and were immediately replaced by a loud, crystal-clear voice of a male newscaster. The urgency in his voice made Twilight snap to attention.
Citizens of Ponyville and all surrounding areas, this is an emergency broadcast. Authorities are ordering every citizen to get into their homes or home of a trusted individual immediately. A pony has been found murdered.
Upon hearing the word murdered, Twilight's nerves clenched tightly. With a gulp, she perked her ears up to listen.
The victim is male, in his mid to late 20s. The body was found on the woods outside of Ponyville just 10 minutes ago, by the local who claimed that they heard the victim screaming. Initial analysis shows the corpse has been completely skinned. Whether this was the cause of death, or done after the subject had already expired, is not yet clear. Police investigation is underway.
Twilight was now shaking and sweating. The description of the crime was causing a wave of nausea to rise up within her, and yet, the sickening feeling that was overtaking her was more than just simple fear. It was something more, but what? Why did this all seem so unreal, so strange?
Police have agreed to divulge up-to-date details on the crime, with hopes that someone listening out there may be able to assist in the arrest of the perpetrator. The tracks leading to the victim's location include the victim's hoofprints and a trail of the victim's blood. Examination shows the victim was in mid-run when he died. A dog tag has also been found around the neck of the victim. Oh, this just in. Leading up to the body were also what appear to be wagon wheel tracks. However, no wagon has been found on or anywhere near the scene.
Twilight's eyes shut open wide, the nauseous feeling hitting its peak, and she struggled to fight back the gag reflex. She only aimed her dilated pupils to the right, and looked through the broken window. However, instead of seeing the view of the pre-dawn sky over the trees, she now only saw blackness. What was happening?
Dog tag on the victim's neck. Police have gone to the address inscribed on it, and have only reported finding a vacant lot. Word has just arrived from the authorities at Ponyville Station. The land once belonged to one Pear Peel Flynn, now deceased. No further information on this individual or any possible connections they may have had to the murder is available at this time.
Pear Peel Flynn. Oh, Madam Flynn.
Twilight's mind reeled with horrifying possibilities as she peered intently at the pitch black that she saw through the defiled window. Why had the scene of the forest and sky vanished? Why did she now only see a screen of darkness? Was she going mad?
Old Madam's skin.
The itch. The itch. She felt the coarse, irritating itch on her upper back beginning to creep in again. With great effort, and without taking her eyes off the blackness through the window, she raised her right hoof and reached behind her, aiming to relieve the sickening tickle.
Still remains a mystery. New update. Police have traced the wagon tracks back to their origin point.
She put her hoof on the irritated area, applied pressure, and rubbed it aggressively.
Appears to be a secluded family cabin in the woods.
And shuddered as she felt her hoof push beneath a bundled layer of skin and slide across the warm, wet tissue.
and the telltale wagon parked within its opening right beside one of the cabin's window.
The radio signal suddenly crackled and dropped silent. Twilight gasped, her heart becoming a cold block of ice. Shaking like mad, she turned her bloodshot eyes to the window once again. She gazed at the black veil that blocked the view of the outside, and recognized it as a black curtain. She held her breath, petrified of what was coming next.
You know it.
A cold shiver snaked down her spine as the swarm of searing needles began to engulf her back once more.
And now...
You feel it.
With that, the curtain flew open, and Twilight screamed and screamed.